everyone, and welcome to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. It is my distinct pleasure to have my good friend Raymond Barrett with us today. Raymond is the Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief with PAR, which stands for Public and Regulatory Report. He is a world-renowned journalist and also author. He has a subject matter expertise in the Middle East, but he writes and edits and thinks about a wide variety of topics. We met because he's had some questions from time to time about the applicability of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And I recently saw him at a conference in Washington, D.C., where we were talking about some of the doings in the Middle East. And I asked him if he would come on to the podcast, and he agreed to do so. So with that, welcome, Raymond. I really appreciate you coming on to visit with us.
Well, thanks for having me.
I think the listeners and viewers probably know at this point you're not speaking American English. So could you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are now?
Okay. Well, you may have guessed I'm from Ireland, but as in I've been here in the US for almost 5 years, as in after working as a journalist in the Middle East for almost a decade.
And what's your current role?
Right now, I am the Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief of PAR, which is part of the Merger Market Group, and we are a news and intelligence services that caters to the corporate and legal world, and we offer news and intelligence on competition law, compliance issues, and other sorts of things.
I understand that you've worked as a journalist in the Middle East and you've lived in the Middle East, so I'd like to see if we can visit a little bit today about some of your thoughts about corruption, anti-corruption, energy-related matters in the Middle East. So if we could kind of go right into it. You've written a series of articles over the years, some of which I've read specifically regarding anti-corruption, and one of the ones that intrigued me was during the Arab Spring awakening, you posed a question in a rather lengthy article. What might that mean for corruption prosecutions, and would FCPA enforcement actions increase? And interestingly, we saw the Libyan Sovereign Wealth Fund file some civil lawsuits. We haven't seen any FCPA enforcement actions yet, but what kind of led you to that thought, and what have you seen or heard since the original Arab Spring awakening?
I think the most interesting thing about Libya was the fact that Colonel Gaddafi went from being a pariah to being brought back into the fold briefly, as in after 9/11. And I think that's one of the issues that will probably have got a lot of companies into trouble, because for many years there were clear signals that Libya was a pariah state, but all of a sudden after 9/11 he sort of came on board, and there was almost active encouragement to re-engage with Libya, as in there was that famous trip of former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair shaking hands with Gaddafi. So I really do think that these major oil companies took that maybe as a sign that it was okay to do business in Libya again. And given the fact that Libya itself was kind of very much controlled by him and his sons, I wouldn't be surprised that a lot of companies who sort of went back into Libya post 9/11 have kind of got themselves into trouble, because clearly both Gaddafi and his sons controlled all major investment in and out of the country. So I think that's the kind of area where a lot of companies would have came into trouble.
Now, obviously the change in regime was a little bit different in Egypt. Mubarak, who was a U.S. ally for many, many years, fell. There was a democratically elected president, and that president has now left the scene, and we have some sort of interim government. There may be elections down the road, but we haven't seen that sort of Egyptian government moving toward in the same way the Libyan Sovereign Wealth Fund did. Could you highlight the differences that you have seen between the Libyan Spring and the Egyptian Spring?
I think you've actually pointed out a very important aspect there is that, and I think I have lots of Egyptian colleagues who basically insist that despite the kind of great changes in 2011, really and truly, Egypt hasn't moved on because essentially speaking, while Mubarak was the figurehead, he was the figurehead of a military government. And that military government has its tentacles all across the Egyptian economy, and essentially speaking, that military government is still in place. The contracts that they would have signed, the business relationships they have signed are all still in place. And I don't think there's going to be major change as a result. A very good source gave me a very interesting kind of take on the relationship between the military and the government. And that during the 2011 crisis, he insisted that the Egyptian Ministry of Defense loaned money to the Egyptian government to basically keep the lights on. So basically that shows that from say, economic point of view, that the Egyptian military isn't like the, say, US military in terms of it just being a military unit. The same in Pakistan. They own factories, they own businesses, they have this huge economic network that it's a self-funding entity. And even if you walk through, say, Washington, D.C., on the way down to Georgetown, the Egyptian defense attaché has its own building, its own separate entity. So I really don't think there's been a major change in Egypt, as in I think if the Muslim Brotherhood had actually managed to stay in power, I think they would have launched a series of, say, anti-corruption investigations, both against not just Hosni Mubarak, but the entire Egyptian military elite. So I believe that since they basically ousted the Brotherhood, that the end result has been that a whole series of potential anti-corruption investigations will likely be quashed as long as the current military government is in power.
Now let's move to the country that really started the Arab Spring awakening in Tunisia, which in many ways, since it sort of erupted and led the charge, has been the most quiet. We haven't really heard a lot from the populace. There haven't been sort of ongoing demonstrations, or at least the violence that we've seen in some of the other countries. And we certainly haven't heard about any sort of anti-corruption initiatives by the new Tunisian government or the U.S. government against U.S. companies or other companies who may have done business there. Now, that may be that Tunisia has less minerals, extractive minerals, but really any thoughts on why Tunisia has been perhaps even different than Egypt or Libya?
Well, I spoke at a conference recently in San Diego, and one of the speakers was an academic who had just came back from an extensive period in Tunisia. And she was kind of speaking with a lot of different NGOs and, say, civil society groups. And the one thing I would say about Tunisia, that whereas at the moment, maybe because of the lack of, say, large multinationals and stuff that were in there compared to somewhere like Libya, there is a definite sense that Tunisian society is much more politically active, and I would expect to see in the next couple of years, for example, the Tunisian branch of, say, Transparency International being more active. Just the general society there seems to be much more educated, much more politicized. She said there is a highly complex series of both like leftist, centrist political groups, feminist groups and whatnot, that just doesn't seem to be present in somewhere like Libya or Egypt, I think, to such a great extent. And I wouldn't be surprised to see in the next couple of years Tunisian civil groups coming together and trying to highlight aspects of, say, corruption. I know that there's been a few cases whereby, at the moment, it's been quite small. I believe the government won a settlement of about $28 million from the wife of the former president that was in a bank in Lebanon. But as regards, there's estimated to be at least several $billion missing. So I think as the government of Tunisia and as different groups come together to try and pursue that money, it'll be just interesting to see what organizations helped the former president to actually, say, launder that money overseas, or helped to actually move that money overseas, and where it's based now as well.
Now, if we could move to another region in the Middle East, more over to the Arab Emirates, and if I could show our viewers your book, Dubai Dreams, that you're the author of, having lived and written about Dubai extensively. Obviously, the Emirates are very different than North Africa, and even different, obviously, than Saudi Arabia. But I thought maybe we might explore why there are some of the differences. But maybe we could start off with some of your thoughts about that I posed to you before we started on. How is it a country or an emirate such as Dubai, which just exploded in growth, obviously exploded in wealth to fuel that growth, yet is perceived to be a relatively safe haven for Westerners and not high perception of corruption?
I think sort of with Dubai, you really have to look back to its history, and that despite the fact that we've been more aware of its growth in the last, say, 10 to 15 years, Dubai has always existed as a sort of regional hub, a regional entrepot for, say, different countries in the region. So as in going back about 100 years, merchants from Iran escaped to Dubai because they were being taxed out of it by the local Shah. Other kind of it was an important route for Britain en route to India to, say, supply back and forth. So Dubai has always been comfortable sort of as a hub. I think the big difference is that it went from being a regional one to being a global one. And maybe that's been the big change. As regards sort of, say, how it does business, I think one of the things that Dubai has always tried to be is that it tries to make a Western company that wants to follow, say, the rules comfortable, but at the same time, if you're a, say, Somali importer or an Iranian importer that needs to go around the rules, they'll always make you comfortable as well. So I think what Dubai has been kind of unique at doing is allowing a sort of, say, parallel business structure to exist almost side by side. As in, for example, the new financial center, they brought in a former British judge to be the kind of regulator of that, to give a certain amount of certainty and, say, security to global investors. Yet at the same time, any day, if you walk down by the creek, there are these old ships full of sanctioned goods that are on their way to Iran. So it's that ability to let those two kind of things exist side by side that has really allowed, I think, Dubai to kind of grow to the extent that it has.
And how does Dubai compare with some of the other emirates, such as Abu Dhabi or any of the others that you could contrast it with?
Well, I think the classic example being sort of, say, Abu Dhabi is much more like your classic Gulf petro sheikhdom, like, say, Kuwait or Qatar. It's got one main resource that's in high demand, low cost to take it out of the ground. So Abu Dhabi hasn't really felt the need to, say, innovate its economy or to open up its economy or to give any sense of empowerment to, say, foreigners, for example. As in, whereas Dubai basically ran out of oil very quickly in the 70s, and it has always had its business model on being a sort of, say, welcoming, easy place for foreigners to do business. So in a way, if you look at sort of, say, Dubai, the biggest difference in Dubai is there is a massive duty-free kind of zone where it's kind of easier for a foreign business to kind of set up, to be established. There's still the aspect of control that you find in other kind of Gulf states where a local partner is needed. But historically, Dubai hasn't been as afraid to empower foreign business owners or foreign investors as much as the other Gulf states.
You know, it sounds like to me you just said once a trader, always a trader.
Exactly. As in, and I always say that Dubai has always established itself as being the place where I think the biggest kind of misconception people have of Dubai is they try to compare it to, say, New York, maybe Hong Kong, or very established global centers. But if you take a compass and you draw a circle around Dubai and look at the area, and you have the Somalia, Ethiopia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, the former Soviet states, and you just have to ask yourself a very simple question. If you think all of those countries are going to undergo a massive change in the next 20 years and become very democratic, peaceable, easy places to do business, then Dubai might be in trouble. But Dubai has always served as a hub from where people who want to invest in that region and people from those regions who want to invest outwardly can go into relative peace and security and do business in an environment that is at least predictable. As in, I think Transparency International, when they do a lot of their surveys, as in, they always kind of survey, and one of their major criticisms is that, for example, Saudi Arabia ranks quite high compared to other nations in being a place that's not corrupt. Some people might argue if you have a ruling family that basically turns the national exchequer into its private expense account, might be corrupt. But on a transactional day-to-day basis, there isn't that pressure that you might find even somewhere like India or kind of Indonesia to get things done. Things can be slow occasionally, but generally speaking, you can get your sort of, say, basic business transaction done relatively smoothly. And that's what Dubai offers compared to like the rest of the region.
Do you see any evidence of increased anti-corruption efforts by any of the Emirates, or by their own nature, they seem to be cautious and move slowly, and it's really status quo?
I would definitely say it's more a case of the status quo, as in they are aware of perception. So, for example, if there is a major incident, like, for example, post 9/11, Dubai got sort of, say, accused as being a place where some of the money was transferred through. They are PR savvy enough to know that those things just cannot be just kind of ignored, and they will respond possibly with passing new laws or taking several initiatives. But as you know, Tom, enforcement is the key. So as in, I do believe that Dubai and the other sort of, say, Gulf states, if there is a say, particular incident and there is a request for a certain person or entity to be dealt with, they have no problem doing that. But in general, as regards making a broad change to their policy, I would say it's more status quo.
And then, do you have any thoughts on, obviously here in Houston, I should have told our audience that you're in Washington and headquartered in Washington, but you do travel all over the globe. One of the things that we talk about is the possible opening up of Iran, possible opening up of the oil fields, excuse me, and the attendant work that would be needed to bring the Iranian oil fields up to even a 21st century standard. They've had sanctions against them for so long. But for the Gulf states, that might mean a major player coming onto the market who has not been in the marketplace for some time. Any thoughts on how the Gulf states might respond to an initiative opening up Iran on a commercial basis?
I would say that given the fact that the smaller Gulf states historically have been very savvy traders, as you said, so I would definitely see, for example, that Iran opening up would probably be a boon for many smaller Gulf states, as in, I wouldn't be surprised if oil services companies would sort of, say, move their headquarters to, say, Dubai, for example. And I do think that the non-oil producers, as in outside Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, would kind of see it as an opportunity. Maybe, and Qatar has a lot of natural gas as opposed to oil. That mightn't be as much of a threat. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, being major oil producers, we've definitely seen Saudi Arabia from a sort of geopolitical sense has been against U.S. engagement with Iran. But I do think, given the current situation, as in of all the parties who are talking right now in, say, Vienna, the kind of P5+1 and Iran, that probably Iran is the country that needs these talks to work. As in, the biggest difference is in that under the Bush administration, they talked a tough game on Iran. But I actually think the Obama administration, despite taking a more conciliatory tone in public, has actually been more effective by expanding the sanctions beyond, say, US borders and bringing these, say, European partners on board, number one, and also bringing on these so-called secondary sanctions, where basically the Obama administration has told companies in India and China, you have a choice now, deal with Iran or deal with us. And I think it's probably those secondary sanctions that have probably driven Iran to the table more so than just a blanket US sanction. So as in, I would definitely see going forward that between bringing on board the Europeans to do more than just pay lip service to sanctions, and then by putting pressure on companies in India and China to make that choice, I actually kind of do envisage, maybe say, Iran being brought on board more and thus possibly seeing more investment in the country.
That's really an interesting observation about the secondary boycotts, if I can use an old union term,
right?
That really bringing Iran to the table. Well, Raymond, unfortunately, we're near our end, but I was wondering if our listeners might want to learn a little bit more about PAR. Where would they go?
Well, then you can go to our website, par-global.com, and then you'll just get a sense of the kind of coverage that we offer. As in, we specialize in sort of, say, competition and other almost compliance issues. We have offices both in, say, DC, in Brussels, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Sao Paulo, and elsewhere. So as in, what we really try to do is offer readers a, say, global perspective on these issues, beyond just being siloed in one individual country.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to visit with us. This has been a fascinating chat, and I hope we can get together again.
Thanks a lot for having me, Tom.
Thank you.